Hello there, welcome to this video. This is probably going to be the only one of its kind I ever make, and I've decided to make it on a very significant birthday, and also I've done it to kind of get a lot of this stuff out of my head about progressive rock. And I should acknowledge at this early stage that I'm very aware that this is going to be another YouTube video where a middle-aged man groans on about progressive rock for 20 minutes, half an hour, or what have you. Um, so what I'm going to be picking out are what I think are my personal choice of what are the best progressive rock albums from that classic era, 1969 to 74, which is something that, if he gets his pointing finger right, Mike Barnes says in his book A New Day Yesterday. He reckons that the key era for progressive rock was 1969 to 74, and that was a conclusion I'd come to years and years ago, so it's good to see it confirmed in print. What I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight, hopefully, one album from each of those years, which I think are pretty much essential listening. But I'm also going to include a lot of kind of runners-up, also rounds, honourable mentions, call them what you will. So let's get straight into it. And I've said it's going to be 69 to 74. So we'll start in the logical place, and that is 1968. And my first choice is Pink Floyd's A Saucer Full of Secrets. And this is, for me, is a really interesting album. It's the album that kind of, in a way, saved Pink Floyd's career, really, having lost Syd Barrett, their leader. And the weird thing is, it's a transitional album. Syd Barrett is on several tracks, notably Jug Band Blues, but it's the tracks without Barrett, the long tracks, the title track and Set the Controls of the Heart of the Sun, which really point the way ahead for Pink Floyd over the next 3 or 4 years. So, and also I would point out that this is I think, a really progressive album for 1968. When you consider the sort of the pop and the sort of the early stages of rock that was around at that time. My other choice for 1968 is a very personal choice, and it is not a progressive rock album, really. It is, let's see if you recognize the cover, it is the Jimi Hendrix Experience, Electric Ladyland Part 1. Now, this is an album I bought a little over 40 years ago as a cash-strapped teenager. And I probably bought Part 1 because I couldn't afford the double album with its rather racy cover. Personally, I prefer this cover. I'd love to know who did the artwork. I think it's absolutely brilliant. As I said, it's not a progressive rock album, but it does have that long track, 1983, A Merman I Should Turn to Be. And that is Jimi Hendrix really stretching out into a piece of music that lasts, 11 or 12 minutes. And it's mainly him and Mitch Mitchell and probably abetted by Eddie Kramer, the engineer. It creates some amazing soundscapes and, again, properly progressive stuff for 1968. So I'm not saying those are essential albums, but they were albums from 1968 that pointed the way into the future. So 1969, arguably where it all began. And where did it all begin? But with In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson. And you can't ignore this album, whether you like it or not. I think the extraordinary thing about King Crimson, the version that recorded this album, is that their entire career fitted into the 12 calendar months of 1969. So you start off with Greg Lake joining the band very early on in the year. Then you have, they start rehearsing, they start gigging, they get management, they try out recording with the Moody Blues producer. It doesn't work. They support the Stones at Hyde Park in July. They then self-produce their first album I think it's recorded mostly in July and August. They commissioned Barry Godber, who sadly died the year after, to produce this incredible cover artwork. The album is released in October. There's no mention of the band or the title of the album on the sleeve, on the outer sleeve anyway. It goes into the top 10. And the management then decide, let's try and crack America. And it all gets a bit too intense for two of the key band members, Michael Giles on drums and Ian MacDonald on keyboards and woodwind. And in December, they quit the band. So, the entire history of King Crimson Part 1 fits into 1969. But what an incredible album. 21st Century Schizoid Man, mind-blowing. And also mind-blowing is the fact that the basic track for that was recorded by the trio of Fripp, Giles and Greg Lake in more or less one take. I mean, amazing. So let's go on to the honourable mentions for 1969. And here's my first one. It is, of course, Ummagumma or Ummagumma by Pink Floyd. Not so much for the live sides, but more for the studio sides on this album. And the impression I get reading the sort of the histories of Pink Floyd is that they went into the studio and nobody really had anything worthy for sort of band recording. So they decided to just effectively split up and give each other half a side of an LP to do whatever they wanted to do. So Richard Wright recorded Sisyphus with a mellotron, probably about the only time a mellotron featured in any way, shape, or form on a Pink Floyd album. You will find plenty of mellotron references in this video, by the way. And Nick Mason and Roger Waters were experimenting with kind of tape cutting and editing techniques, very similar to what the BBC Radiophonic Workshop was doing at the time. And of the four of them, I suppose Dave Gilmour, his Narrow Way, is the most kind of Pink Floyd sounding. But, it's really hard to sort of try and convey just how radical this music was for 1969. Okay, Frank Zappa was doing similar things across the pond, but in the UK, I would venture to suggest that the studio sides of Ummagumma are about as progressive as it really got for that sort of time. My other nomination for 69 is a bit off the wall, and you're probably not familiar with it, and it is Manfred Mann Chapter 3, and self-titled debut album, which is on Vertigo Records, the Spiral Vertigo label. And weirdly, this album was released the same year that the Manfred Mann pop group released its last single in the UK, Ragamuffin Man, which I personally love, and it got into the top 10, I think. But Manfred Mann and Mike Hugg wanted to go off and effectively produce an anti-pop album. They'd been doing too much pop, and they wanted to do something else. So they formed a band with the two of them on keyboards, Mike Hugg on sort of strange whispered vocals, a bassist, a drummer, and a horn section. So this album probably has a lot more to do with jazz than certainly pop. And what I like about it is, its uniqueness for a start. You might have heard the parts of the track One Way Glass in a track sampled by The Prodigy in the 90s or 2000s. But it's just the fact that it's this blend of jazz and rock and all everywhere, all points in between. It is quite an incredible album, in my opinion. And yes, it's pretty progressive. Is it progressive rock? I don't really know, but it's certainly worth listening to. Now we're going to go on to 1970, and I had a bit of a problem with 1970 because I thought of all the albums that came out that year, things like Atom Heart Mother by Pink Floyd and Time in a Word by Yes and Trespass by Genesis, and I got the impression that these are all albums that were kind of steps along the way for these bands. They're not really essential listening. And in the end, I had to cheat a little bit, and I really apologise for that, because my nomination for 1970 is the Yes album. And this was recorded in 1970, but it wasn't released until February 1971. So I have bent the rules a little bit. But this is a great album. I mean, what have we got on here? Yours Is No Disgrace, Starship Trooper, I've Seen All Good People. And it's, of course, the first album with Steve Howe on board, but it's still got Tony Kaye on keyboards doing his kind of sheets of sound on the Hammond organ. And I like that combination. I like the fact that this wasn't a band of sort of five virtuosos all trying to sort of solo at the same time. Tony Kaye was more restrained as a keyboard player than Rick Wakeman, and it makes the album I don't know, unique and a bit more listenable. And of course, it's unique in the fact that this lineup of Yes only lasted for one album. So that would be my choice for 1970, even though it was technically released in 1971. Honourable mentions. Can't really ignore In the Wake of Poseidon by King Crimson. And I've read somewhere that Poseidon was Robert Fripp's attempt to re-record King Crimson's debut album without Ian MacDonald, who of course had left. I'm not sure if I agree with that. I think basically Robert Fripp was backed into a corner, and with the momentum still there behind King Crimson, he had to put together whatever band he could and record a follow-up album. And so he effectively reconvened Giles, and Fripp as the kind of the core recording unit, and then added on whoever he could, whether it's Greg Lake on vocals or Keith Tippett on piano, Mel Collins on saxes, etc., etc. Side one to me is easily the equal of the first album. The title track, In the Wake of Poseidon, a complete and utter mellotron fest. Absolutely love it. Side two, maybe not so good, but I've got a funny feeling this album actually charted higher than the debut, so that's amazing. Oh, and if you're going to include King Crimson's album, then I suppose I'm going to have to include MacDonald and Giles's album, Ian MacDonald and Michael Giles's self-titled album that was released in the autumn of 1970. There's Giles on the front, there's Ian MacDonald on the back, and all in this kind of purpley glow, which was very in at the moment at that time. I think a lot of Vertigo records had this kind of purpley tint to their photographic covers. And this is not a progressive rock album. I suppose you could call it a progressive pop album, but it's, I don't want to say nice or pleasant, but it's just a really good listen. And the mellotron has been junked. We've now got things like a string section replacing it. I think Ian MacDonald has expressed the fact that he's not fully on board with it. With hindsight, he didn't like it a great deal. I love it. It's funny enough. It's the one album. I think the one album I've owned on album, CD, and cassette. Don't ask me why. I just picked them up and played them in different formats down the years. And it's an album I've probably had in one form or another for about 40 years. So definitely worth listening to. And I got another choice for 1970, which is a bit off the wall. I mentioned with regard to Manfred Mann, Chapter 3, that at the end of the 60s, certainly 1969, 1970, there was this kind of intermingling of musical forms, jazz, blues, rock, folk, all from all over the place. And where better to listen to something like that than on a compilation album of the time? And this is Picnic, A Breath of Fresh Air. And this was Harvest's double album compilation from 1970, famed for, of course, having an unreleased Pink Floyd track on there called Embryo, which probably most of you are familiar with. But it's a really interesting cross-section of Harvest's output at the time. And basically just worth a listen. Okay, 1971. Things are starting to hot up a bit in the progressive rock field. And I think my choice for essential listening for this year is going to be a little bit controversial because there was a lot going on in 1971. You got Tarkus by Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Nursery Crime by Genesis. What else have we got? Medal by Pink Floyd, including Echoes, which is just an amazing track. Fantastic recording quality for its time and just a fantastic listen. But I'm going to go with a very personal choice for 1971, and that is Moving Waves by Focus. And I've got an awful lot of time for Focus, and I should point out that I think Paul Stump has as well, because there are quite a few mentions of the band in his book about progressive rock, The Music's All That Matters. That's the 2010 edition, by the way. And yeah, I think Focus were amongst the most melodic of the progressive rock bands, and I've always had an awful lot of time for them for that reason. They're such a melodic band, and I think Moving Waves, arguably their best album. And what's good about Focus is actually in their time they only released 5 studio albums, and in my opinion 3 of them are really worth listening to. There's a bit of a spoiler alert there. My other choices for 1971, I'm really sorry, I haven't got them to show you. I haven't got them on record, or vinyl, if you like. The first is Porn Hearts by Van der Graaf Generator, and that is the first album I think I've listened to where the instrumental extremes are matched by the vocal extremes. The first time I heard it, which actually wasn't that long ago, maybe 5-10 years ago, I was almost literally blown away. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And it's got to be recommended on that basis. I'd also recommend another album that isn't a progressive rock album, and it's The Inner Mounting Flame by Mahavishnu Orchestra, because that was such an influential record. This band doing these tracks in sort of 7/4 and 9/8, 13/8, all these weird time signatures, was very influential on the likes of Yes and Genesis, and it kind of set the musical scene for the next 2 or 3 years. Progressive bands suddenly went to themselves, well, do we have to do we have to do this in 4/4? Can we not do this section in 5/4, 9/8, whatever? So that's my other sort of runner-up recommendation for 1971. Not a progressive rock album, but certainly one that was greatly influential on the sort of rock scene of the time. So on to 1972. And here's my choice. It's an obvious choice. It's Close to the Edge by Yes. 3 tracks. The title track, Siberian Cartridge, and You and I. They're just brilliant all the way through. And the sonic landscape they create, particularly with the aid of the sort of reverb-soaked mellotron, is really quite amazing. And it's often in the sort of top 5 of the progressive rock albums of all time, and I totally go along with that, even though you could argue this is one of those albums that merits that slightly pejorative term prog rock, when people, oh, that's just prog rock, airy fairy lyrics, great long solos, long tracks. It's a term used as a term of derision, and I don't particularly like it much. As far as I'm concerned, this is all progressive music of one form or another, and this is an exemplar of that, certainly. What else have we got going on in 1972? Foxtrot by Genesis, which I'm choosing largely on the basis of Watcher of the Skies and, of course, the Supper's Ready. I'm also a little bit biased because only a few weeks ago I saw the tribute band The Musical Box at Cambridge and recreate the Genesis live concert of 1973. Quite amazing, absolutely incredible, and definitely worth seeing if you haven't seen them. It might be a case of catch them whilst you can, I think, because they're not getting any younger. But Foxtrot is generally regarded as the sort of exemplar album of early Genesis. I've never been the world's biggest fan of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I'm going to be honest with you. I think they fit that kind of prog rock term, and they symbolise the excess of some of the prog rock bands. And yet, I do have a bit of a soft spot for Trilogy, which is their 1972 album. Not least because I acquired this album about 10 years ago from a record shop for something silly like £2 or £3, and it's a first pressing, and it plays really well. And I think it's possibly their most accessible album. I think they are showing off their musicianship without being completely and utterly show-offy. So that's my other recommendation for 1972. Oh, and not forgetting Focus. This is actually an American copy of Focus 3. This was the album, the double album that they released in the autumn of that year, and it shows their earthier, rockier side. I think it's an album where the keyboard player, Thijs van Leer, has to sort of step back a tiny bit and allow Jan Akkerman on guitar and Pierre van der Linden on drums to really stretch out and slightly rule the roost slightly. But having said that, it's a very balanced album in terms of the influence that the individual members bring to bear on it. Good album, worth listening to, and it's one of those albums that conveniently fits on a single CD. Where are we now? 1973, and well, this is going to be a bit obvious, so apologies for that. Oh yes, there's my window there. Can you see it? This is, of course, Dark Side of the Moon, and this is an album which is iconic for a number of reasons, not least the iconic cover art. And I think Dark Side of the Moon can be compared in many ways to Sgt. Pepper's, which was 6-7 years earlier, in that, as taken as a whole, it's something of a work of art. You've got the iconic cover, you've got a gatefold sleeve, you've got little freebie bits in the front flap, sold by the bucket load. The only difference is that Sgt. Pepper's was hugely influential at the time. I'm not really sure how influential Dark Side of the Moon was. Its massive sales have a lot to do, I think, with the music and the lyrics and the fact that it just all came together for Pink Floyd at that time. And what more can you say about Dark Side of the Moon? I've heard bits of it far too much now. Great Gig in the Sky, Money, but the rest of the album is amazing. And it was a culmination of Pink Floyd's career to that point, and to some extent they didn't quite know what to do afterwards, but that's another story. Oh, Now things are going to start to get a bit interesting now. Tubular Bells. This is one of my kind of runners-up nominations. And Tubular Bells is important for on a number of levels. First of all, you've just got to respect the fact that it was put together by one guy in his late teens. He was 20 when it was released. And, it's an incredible piece of work. But more importantly, it allowed Richard Branson's Virgin label to hit the ground running and to sign up all manner of bands who probably wouldn't have got signed had not the Virgin coffers been rather overflowing at the time. And one of those bands, and this is a really off-the-wall choice, is Henry Cow. And this is their first album, which is variously called Legend or Leg End. And what I like about Henry Cow is that their music, which is predominantly instrumental, seems to exist somewhere between sort of strict composition, everything written out in charts and what have you, and improvisation. And it's really hard to sort of tell where one ends and the other begins. And for that reason, I just find Henry Cow an incredibly interesting band. I can listen to their music over and over again, mainly because it is so unpredictable. You just don't really know what's going to come next. And it's not to everybody's taste. And in fact, there's one track on here, which I think I regularly skip over because it is a little bit too dissonant. But that's one of my runners-up recommendations. And talking of bands we weren't sure what was coming next, also on the Virgin label, Hatfield and the North. I bought this album only about 10 days ago. I've had it on CD for ages, never had it on vinyl. And again, what an amazing record. It's so unpredictable. What's coming next? I have no idea. And compared to Henry Cow, it must be said, Hatfield and the North had bucket loads of humour involved, sort of literal humour in the lyrics, and indeed musical humour, and the way they employed a few sound effects as well, a bit in the sort of Pink Floyd way. A great album, and like I said, to the uninitiated, you really can't predict what's going to happen next on that record. It's amazing. Oh, one more nomination. Genesis, Selling England by the Pound. I did have this on vinyl. My wife put it in the washing machine, and look at it now. I'm joking, of course. This is one of those Japanese mini LPs, and I'm choosing this mainly for Firth of Fifth and Cinema Show, and the fact that it is staggeringly well recorded for its time. Okay, we're nearing the end. So on to 1974, and I've already said I regard this to be the final year of the kind of classic era of progressive rock. And again, Mike Barnes, there he is, seems to agree as well. And my pick for 1974 is Red by King Crimson. And just as King Crimson sort of begin the kind of classic era of progressive rock, so effectively they close it really with this album, which was released in the autumn of that year. And of course, by that time, King Crimson was a very, very different band. I think they'd been informed to some extent by the kind of jazz rock era, shall we say, started by a Mahavishnu Orchestra a few years before. And yet there's a real sense of an ending on this album. The fact that, Robert Fripp invites back Ian MacDonald and Mel Collins to kind of guest on the album. The Mellotron is back, and particularly on the final track, Starless, which is absolutely an amazing track. So that would be my main pick for 1974. I've actually got quite a few sort of runners-up for 1974. Amongst them, Genesis's hugely ambitious The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway album. I wish I'd seen the musical box do this live, I must say, just as I'd love to have seen Genesis do it live back in the day, but I was only 9 or 10 at the time. Very ambitious, possibly overstretching themselves a little bit. And of course, effectively, it was the record that sort of broke the band in a way. It led to Peter Gabriel walking away from them, but still a hugely ambitious album, and definitely worth a listen. That one. You'll enjoy this. Again, another personal choice. Hamburger Concerto by Focus. An album much more in the vein of Moving Waves. I get the impression on this album that Thijs van Leer is back in the driving seat, and there's also talk that actually when they recorded it, it was mostly done as a trio, with Jan Akkerman recording his own parts separately, which is a rather sad story. I'd like to think it's not true, but it might have been. And this was a band that was just slowly falling apart a little bit by this point. But this is still a really, really good album. Very melodic progressive rock album. You've seen them once already. Here they are again with another sock cover. And this is Henry Cow's Unrest, one of the most appropriately named albums of all time, because this is uneasy listening. You might get times of sort of electronic and sort of musical skronk on here and dissonance, and yet other times of great sort of melodic rock, and sometimes they exist in parallel, as on the last track, I do believe. So if you like uneasy listening, but good listening all the same, that's one to try out, certainly. And if you don't try anything else out, listen to the opening track, Bitten Storm over Ulm, which is about as close as they come to being truly accessible in a 2.5-minute track. Oh, and another choice for 1974, again, is not a progressive rock album, but massively influential and pointing the way to the future. And it's Phaedra, I hope I've pronounced that right, Phaedra by Tangerine Dream. A landmark electronic album. Yeah, without this, you wouldn't have had Jean-Michel Jarre and all the rest of it. Just an incredibly great album, and amazingly one that got into the top 20 thanks to the patronage of John Peel. Now, controversy corner now, because I'm going to go on to 1975, and there are some good records around in 1975. There's The Rotters Club by Hatfield and the North. There's Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd. There's some great rock albums like Physical Graffiti by Led Zeppelin. But is there anything kind of essential from the progressive rock field from 1975? I'm not sure. And for that reason, I don't have any recommendations at all. So we will skip quickly to 1976. And I appreciate we're out of the range of this video now, which was supposed to be 69 to 74. But, I can't leave without mentioning A Trick of the Tail by Genesis. And this was the album that kind of rebooted their career. And the one that proved to the critics that Genesis could survive without Peter Gabriel. A lot of them thought they couldn't. And strangely enough, it has a lot in common with Selling England by the Pound, in my opinion. This kind of yellowy cover, incredible recording quality for the time. The opening track, Dance on a Volcano, is my kind of headphone testing track and has been for years. If I need to know how good a pair of headphones is, on goes Dance on a Volcano. It's a really good album. And I don't know what more to say about it. It's absolutely brilliant. But that's all I can say for 1976. I've got nothing else to say for then. And we're near the end. So we just have a couple of quick ones from 1977. Animals by Pink Floyd, arguably one of their best albums, but one that's sort of a little bit lost in between Wish You Were Here and The Wall. But, strangely enough, actually, I'm thinking about it, it's a little bit similar to Close to the Edge. You've got one really long track and two quite long tracks, and that's more or less the whole of it. And certainly the long track, Dogs, brilliant. And Sheep is great as well. That's as close as Pink Floyd ever got to rocking out on a track as you'll ever hear. So that's a really good album. And last, hopefully not least, Going for the One by Genesis. And this was recorded after the band had been on a 2 or 3 year hiatus. And it's a great return to form. I personally find the production a little bit shrill and tinny and what have you. But that's worth listening to, definitely. Awaken on here is an incredible track, quite amazing. Now, interesting, just mentioning that hiatus that Yes went through. The middle 70s was a time when a lot of bands were no longer producing an album a year. It was an album every 2 years. In the case of King Crimson, there were no albums at all. And I think that created a void into which, not an awful lot filled it initially, but a lot of young people who were wanting a lot of new and exciting music were not getting it. So they invented it themselves, and that was punk and new wave and what have you, which was really necessary, I think, to sort of wipe away those rather bland middle years of the 1970s. And of course, it's not the end of progressive music. You could argue that any new bit of pop or rock music has a sort of progressive element because it's trying to sort of move on from what's gone before. So whilst the key years of progressive rock are 1969 to 74, progressive music carried on, sometimes in the mainstream, sometimes not. Probably didn't really return to the mainstream until, I don't know, Radiohead in the 1990s, OK Computer, that kind of thing. But as I hope I've demonstrated to you, there's a lot of really great music to listen to from that classic era of progressive rock, 1969 to 74. Thanks for watching.